Hi there, my name's Gail Duffus. I'm an Education Officer with Education Scotland and I lead on the RAISE programme which Falkirk are part of. Laura and Barbara asked me to prepare a little overview about the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework, so I thought I'd take some time to just talk you through some key sort of bits of information that hopefully might help you engage with it. So what I've tried to include in this presentation is a wee bit of information about what the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework is and how you could consider using this in your school or in your cluster, and particularly link it into your school improvement planning cycle. Just to give you a bit of background, you might already be aware of the STEM strategy document, which was published way back in October 2017. It's quite an accessible document, quite an accessible read. But really it sets out Scotland's kind of blueprint or map, if you like, for STEM and how we're going to engage through education and training and really make ourselves a bit of a STEM nation. Within that, there were a number of kind of key actions, if you like, and one of those was to produce the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework for schools and other settings. So I've included in here the link to the STEM strategy document if you want to read it, and obviously throughout this presentation generally any links that are useful I've tried to include. So the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework is also included as attachments to this, and there are two different versions of this framework. There's this version, this is the cover of it, it's about 19 pages long, and it's quite a detailed version, probably most suited for STEM coordinators and senior leads within the school or setting. But there's also a second version which is on the next slide. So this version is probably more suitable for use with practitioners in the classroom to get them involved in the discussions, but hopefully just it gives a nice overview of some of the kind of key points that are involved in our self-reflection and self-evaluation of STEM, so hopefully that's helpful. When we put together the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework, we didn't want it to become yet another document that links to other aspects of the curriculum. And so when this document was put together, we actually drew on the quality indicators that we're all familiar with in school, from how good is our school for and how good is our early learning and childcare. So we've tried to kind of create a document that has familiarity within it. It really is there to help stimulate discussion and start to think about actions that you might want to take forward. So just in the way that you would normally do your kind of standards and quality report and then sort of look to inform your school improvement plan, this is kind of seen to be part of that. It's that idea of trying to encourage our practitioners and staff across the school to engage in that rich discussion and dialogue and really start to think about where we're at in our STEM journey and where we want to go next. So this really is a document that gets you thinking about what you want to do with STEM in your setting. And what I would say about the document is there are obviously, as you know from Higios and HigioELK, there are loads of quality indicators. This isn't a document that you would use in its entirety. It's not something that you would engage with from the straight off and want to look at every quality indicator. I would suggest you only want to maybe look at 2 or 3 at a time, and probably have those in line with your other school priorities and the other quality indicators that perhaps you're already looking at within your school. We've also tried to keep things that are kind of related to STEM or indeed other curricular areas within this framework too. So developing the young workforce, we really tried to provide a key link to that, because I think it's about trying to make these things join up. They kind of go hand in hand so that STEM isn't seen as a standalone thing, nor as DYW. It's about trying to kind of keep it all together. So hopefully this is a guide, a kind of route map, if you like, for you to use if you want to evaluate and reflect on your approaches to STEM and look at where you want to go next with that. What I thought I would do is actually just share some examples of some of the quality indicators within the framework and just talk about examples of where we've seen interesting practice in some other schools and settings, but also think about some of the other things that you might want to tie in with this. So I've just got 3 examples of quality indicators. Of course, it's not an exhaustive list, and if there's a particular quality indicator that you want to focus on, then I'd be more than happy to have a chat with you about how you might want to take that forward in your setting, or some of the other things that I've seen when I've been out and about working in schools. I think with this particular quality indicator, I think most schools or settings are reflecting on this right now when we think about our approach to blended learning when we come back in August. And we're really thinking there about, what work can we do in school, what work can our young people do at home, how can we support that? And I suppose linked to that, we're also thinking about our outdoor spaces and thinking about opportunities for outdoor learning. So how does that fit into our rationale and design for our STEM curriculum? And how do we bring these other things to life through STEM as a kind of rich context? You'll see in this quality indicator at the bottom of the page, there are some challenge questions, and these feature throughout the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework. And I'll touch on these at the end, but they might be something that's quite useful to use when you want to sort of stimulate some discussion or dialogue with colleagues in school. But for this particular quality indicator, I thought here maybe it's an opportunity to think about your approaches to interdisciplinary learning and think about the kind of the refreshed curriculum narrative, which I'm happy to talk about on Friday or indeed at another time over the next few months. I think at the minute when we're so focused in schools and we're asked to focus in August on literacy, numeracy, health and well-being, how can we ensure that our other curricular areas are not left behind? How can we integrate those into our learning and teaching in our new normal, if you like, while we wait for things to settle? We have to be aware about how we could include developing the young workforce in our work here and how these things can go hand in hand. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you some examples of some of the documents and perhaps approaches that you might want to consider. You'll know that there are key documents that we use when we talk about developing the young workforce, and that includes the Career Education Standard. But I've just highlighted two specific resources within that suite of resources, which might be helpful if you want to think about where you're at with DYW and how you're engaging with the Career Education Standard. So the learning resource and the little sort of the self-evaluation wheel are both quite useful for us to consider if we're starting to think about where we want to go with DYW and how that could link to STEM. I think what's important here as well is to start small. We don't need to change everything overnight. So it's just about picking maybe an aspect and thinking, how can I take this forward in my setting? So for example, when I was talking a minute ago about literacy, numeracy and health and well-being, of course that's something that we do all of the time, but as a first step into trying to integrate in with other curricular areas, to think about how we can put the M in STEM, the maths in STEM, maths and numeracy. Is it about how we can look at a concept in maths but apply that or sort of delve a wee bit deeper, if you like, through the science and technology E's and O's? Perhaps that's a route to take. What I'd also think about here though is actually, what does this mean for us here in Falkirk? What I've included on this slide is some information from Skills Development Scotland. And Skills Development Scotland have produced recent infographics, just a kind of two-page PDF file that kind of gives an overview of employment in Forth Valley area. So here I've got a list of the employing sectors just last year and a forecast of what the employment is going to look like up until 2029. And the reason I wanted to include this here when we're thinking about STEM and we're thinking about developing the young workforce is just to show you that many of the industries and employment growth areas that are here and local for you actually involve STEM. So just about making our young people aware of that so that they can think about, actually, is this something for them? Should they have aspirations in these areas? So I've included the PDF and the link for this infographic in the presentation and as an attachment that will be loaded on to the resource sharing file. Here is the link to the regional skills assessment infographic that I was talking about in the last slide. But here I've also started to reflect a wee bit on skills and thinking about perhaps as a school or an individual setting or indeed as a cluster, how you might want to take forward your STEM work. So is it about focusing on the skills that we use in our learning and teaching? And is it about how that relates to our careers and our opportunities and the aspirations of our young people? So I know that in Falkirk we obviously focus on the 5 Falkirk skills, but I know something that also resonates quite closely and maps quite closely to that is some further work that Skills Development Scotland have done on skills in the fourth industrial revolution. So this link here actually plays into a video, just a very, very short video that talks about the kind of skills needed for our future economy. And those skills are broken down into these three main headers. And that does kind of link really well with some of the work that the RAISE officers and others are doing to really think about how we develop that confidence in our young people, so that they become more aware of the jobs that are available for them in the future. And of course, many of those jobs are jobs that haven't even been created as yet, but just thinking about how we can link to that. So this is just a bit of food for thought around this quality indicator, maybe something to consider and share with parents, this particular video, or indeed share with staff just to give them a bit of inspiration and food for thought. The next quality indicator I've chosen to reflect on is quality indicator 2.5 on family learning. And this one really is probably quite relevant right now when we think about the engagement we're doing with our parents and actually how we try and develop those relationships in this current climate. So with this quality indicator, what we're looking at is what does that engagement look like? How do we involve our families in our discussions around STEM and our planning around what we might want to take forward within our school community? How do we look outwards? How do we look out with our own setting to look at the practice that's going on elsewhere? And how do we make that relate to our local context? So again, I've got some examples that I just wanted to share with you, and these revolve around some schools and settings that I have been able to visit in the last little while. Tried to include in this one some examples of early years establishments, primary establishments and secondary, but of course for every quality indicator there will be slight differences in terms of your approach, perhaps depending on your setting, but I've tried to include some examples of each. The first example I wanted to include was a school that I was really lucky enough to visit a couple of years ago now actually, but I've kept in touch with them, and that's Stanley Primary School in North Ayrshire. Now Stanley Primary School were a really interesting school to visit because they were really engaged with their parents. They had a lot of family learning going on in the school, and how did they do that? Well, the issue for them was actually around employment. The area that Stanley Primary School is in had a major kind of STEM employer closed down, and so for a lot of the parents that meant that they were unemployed, and in actual fact kind of science and STEM was just something that wasn't talked about because it brought up such bad memories, and it was associated with a time of sort of a decline in employment. And so coupled with that, the area that the school was in had a high SIMD 1 and 2 profile, and so the children didn't really have great aspirations. They didn't think that science or STEM was for them. In fact, most of the parents thought that science was a hard thing to do, and therefore they weren't really encouraging the children to engage with that. And the school identified that and decided that they really wanted to do something about it. But because of the perception of parents, they felt that they had to tackle that first. And so what they did was they involved some of those parents who were unemployed, got them involved in a working group and had them starting to think and discuss about how they could improve children's kind of life prospects, aspirations, potential for them to engage with science and STEM. And through that kind of small working group, that initial working group, they tried to kind of bring on board other parents within the community. And of course, there were and are parents in the community that work and have really fantastic jobs, and such a range of jobs available for the young people to hear about. And so what they wanted to do was just encourage those parents to come into school and talk about what they were doing. But what was also really interesting to see was that they wanted to develop a kind of family learning club so that the parents could help the children and build their own confidence and that of the children around science and STEM. And so with this working party, they set up a Saturday club. It just ran for 4 weeks initially, an hour a week, and a couple of the teachers gave up their time to get the families to come in and do some learning together around STEM, so using some kind of STEM challenges and activities. Just started to get that working, and actually for many of you that will be something that you've already done, perhaps not on a Saturday, but perhaps after school or on an open day or afternoon. And such was the success of that club that it had to actually be extended to 8 weeks the next term, and it kind of grew arms and legs actually. So they started then thinking about healthy eating and cooking and improving their cooking skills. And so the catering team from the school gave up their time and started to come in to show the parents how to engage with some healthy eating, how to grow their own vegetables, and really it snowballed from there. And as a school community, it really kind of brought parents and the young people and the staff of the school really together, and really that true kind of idea of a community was kind of developed from there. Another setting that I've been able to visit is Shawmore Nursery, just in the south side of Glasgow. And this nursery did quite a lot of work actually, both outside the nursery and inside, to think about developing their STEM learning environment. And of course, with parents coming in and out the nursery often, they wanted the setting, the environment to reflect STEM, and for the parents and those picking up the young people to see that and see what it was all about. So they really reimagined their spaces. They didn't have the kind of classic house corner. They didn't have kind of pink and blue toys. It was very much kind of gender neutral toys, gender neutral colours. They were trying to really show that STEM, excuse me, STEM was part and parcel of much of what they were doing in the setting. Through redeveloping that learning environment and raising awareness of STEM through their displays and the information they were sharing with parents, they also really wanted to encourage parents to come in and talk about their jobs, their roles, and what that looked like. And what was really interesting about this setting was it's a new build nursery on the side of a school, but their outdoor space is absolutely tiny. They've got a tiny little concrete space just outside. Just, you can kind of maybe see it in the right hand picture here. And in that very small space, they've crammed an amazing number of things as I'm sure you have in your settings when you've got maybe limited space. But what was interesting when they were talking about occupations was they were able to partner up with Scottish and Southern Electric, and some of the staff that worked there were able to come in and talk about their kind of engineering roles, their roles in developing novel approaches to technologies. And so with their outside space, they actually had some of the team from SSE come in with, you know, high-vis jackets, hard hats, some of the kind of fencing that goes up when you're maybe working on with pipes or other different parts of the kind of underground infrastructure, if you like. So they almost set up like a sort of mini work site, if you like, outside. And so the kids were able to really see that kind of coming to life and see and learn a wee bit more about the skills that are involved in those jobs, and what kind of roles you can take on. Interesting too that they ran a series of open evenings, and the young people in the nursery setting were working with a 3D printer. So they designed little Christmas baubles using a 3D printer, and they were bringing the parents in to see that and see what the children were capable of really. And also then I think they were also being made to buy them through an Enterprising Schools project as well, which was quite interesting. And of course, the things, with their limited open space, they were still, inviting parents in really quite informally, just to talk about STEM and science, but also to think about how they could contribute, what information they could be sharing or talking about. So just about building parents' confidence as well, which I think is really important. I've included here some other examples that might be helpful to you, just thinking about where we're at right now with our blended learning. That first example, Northmuir Primary up in Kirriemuir, just within Angus Council area, that link takes you to some how-to videos that they have produced around some of the strategies that they would use to help families and parents engage with literacy and numeracy approaches. So I just put that in just as an example of something that might be quite helpful. I think longer term, perhaps something to consider is thinking about science or STEM homework clubs or after school clubs that might be a way of engaging our parents and our families and encouraging them to come along so that they can support the young people with their learning. And again, I know there are examples of that already going on within the Falkirk Council area. Experiment boxes and STEM bags are something that I've seen quite a lot of and been used really effectively actually to start to bridge that gap between school and home and start to think about some of the ways in which we can even get our vocabulary for science and STEM improved, how we can think about the parents' role in engaging with something a wee bit different in terms of that kind of learning at home. And so I've got some examples of this on the next couple of slides, but that's something that perhaps even in our new blended learning approach after the summer holidays might still be possible, just to send home some very basic bits and pieces that might be able to encourage some of that STEM learning. The last example I just wanted to talk about in this slide was an example of something I saw up in Aberdeenshire in the Huntly cluster. They were actually able to use some of their pupil equity funding to pilot their approaches to family learning. And they were really keen there, where perhaps they didn't get significant engagement with parents before, to think about how they could bring them into school. And they ran some sessions across their cluster, quite a rural cluster, but across their cluster a couple of times during the day. So once during the school day and once at an evening, where they were encouraging parents and extended family members to come into the school and actually work on some STEM challenges with the young people. And in actual fact, I was along to 2 of the sessions that they ran, and they had near enough 100% attendance from their parents. And you know, the kind of buzz in the room, it was just lovely to see that the children and their families learning together. And we had some really nice intergenerational learning going on there, where you had grandparents coming in. And actually, as a result of one of those sessions, there was a grandparent that was talking about knitting, and she now comes in and does some knitting with a little group of children in one of the settings, and she hopes to extend that to another school. So it's just terrific. Here's an example of one of the STEM bags that I was talking about. This is a family learning centre, again just on the south side of Glasgow, and what they were doing was they were preparing these little bags with all the necessary equipment and a kind of nice laminated card to send home to with the children, so that they could engage with parents or carers at home around a kind of STEM challenge or a STEM activity. And what this centre encouraged the families to do was, where they could, to either take pictures of the work, which is what you see here, and send those back in with the bag, or if they were able to put a tweet up on the centre's Twitter feed and just share that learning in that way. And it was a really positive experience for all the young people and their families involved, and that work still continues. For yourselves in Falkirk, this is a school that I'm sure that you know well, and I would encourage you to get in touch with the STEM team at Denny High to find out more about this. But of course, that family learning does extend right into our secondary context as well. And this is an example of the Denny High School parents engaging with a boat building challenge that the school ran. And you can see that it was really well attended. And of course, that then also provides that opportunity to link into the DYW and think about the parents' careers and perhaps opportunities for them to engage with the school a bit more widely. Denny also produced this helpful overview to send to the parents, I think, following one of the activities, just to get them thinking about the kind of support that they can offer as parents to help their young people, their children, engage with science and STEM. The final quality indicator I've chosen to look at today is that of transitions. And I know at this time that transitions are a wee bit tricky, but just thinking ahead to this time next year, when hopefully perhaps we might be a wee bit more settled, it might be something that you want to consider as an individual setting, or indeed this one typically would be really useful to consider across a cluster of schools. So thinking about that approach to transition, how we share information, what information we share, and how helpful it might be to use STEM as that kind of context. So I've just got an example to share from a school in Edinburgh that I've been working with recently and their approach, and then also I've tried to tie it into how we might use that to help with our profiling and our understanding of where our children are at on their learning journey. The example I'm using here is an example of some transition work that took place between primary schools and secondary schools in a cluster in Edinburgh. But of course, there will be examples of transition work that we could look to explore between our nursery and primary settings that could involve STEM in addition. So in this school cluster in Edinburgh, what they decided to look at was skills. They really wanted to focus on a set of skills that all the schools would use and that the young people would have experience of throughout primary and then on into the secondary school. What we decided to do was get the cluster of schools together with some representatives from the science department as well as from each of the cluster primary settings. What we did through the RAISE programme was ran some professional learning from them around a transition project that we'd been developing around astrobiology, which is the kind of biology of space. We'd created a series of professional learning videos, some resources, they were all kind of mapped to the experiences and outcomes. We looked at the E's and O's for science, but also for some other curricular areas to really make quite a rich context for learning. So we trained all of the primary school teachers in the upper kind of primary, P5 to 7, and members of the science department in these resources, and then gave them some time to think about how they could use them. And the idea was that there was actually plenty of resources to use across both the primary and the secondary context. But what the schools had to do was agree who was going to do what when. And what came out of that was the schools looked at all of the experiments and other resources that were supplied and decided what they were going to do in primary 6, what they were going to do in primary 7, what they were going to do in transition days, and what they were going to follow up on in S1. So it became a really nice drawn out approach to transition, which worked really well for them to then better understand what prior knowledge the children had as they were coming through primary school, to allow them to develop some of their skills and understandings in a really interesting and topical aspect of science in upper primary, and then for that work to be followed up on in the secondary setting. And as part of that, they focused on writing up experiments, which brought in some of the literacy and numeracy skills that they were looking to develop, and really helped the secondary school practitioners think about actually the journey on into senior phase, when perhaps we need to focus more on those experimental write-ups. So how can we start to introduce them earlier and start to develop skills and understanding of that, so that then we can take some of the other aspects of our work forward in secondary. And I think on reflection from speaking to the schools that were involved in that work and who continue to work together, it really has forged that strong cluster relationship. The primary schools perhaps may borrow resources or ask secondary colleagues in the science department for ideas for a new experiment to try, or a new approach, or maybe just to build their own understanding about a particular topic. But equally, the secondary school are already starting to think about how they can build on the prior learning and approaches used in the primary, so that they start to really think about that true progression in learning and what does that look like. I also included this example here just to kind of give a link and a nod, if you like, to the opportunities this might create for thinking about our approaches to profiling. So how do we track engagement in STEM? How do we look at progress, skill development, and how do we allow our children to be involved in the discussions around that? And I think here, again, it's important to think about what work is already done in early years and also in our primary school settings, and how that can be built on to look at that kind of aspect of profiling right across the school. And this is just an example of a piece of work that was done in one school in S2, where they were starting to look at actually the children completing this work. You know, where do they think they are making most progress with? How do they feel they did with particular tasks that were linked to skills or linked to experiences and outcomes? What can they say about their learning? How can the children explain their strengths and also their next steps, which is often quite helpful. So that's maybe something to consider too. I've shared a few examples of some of the quality indicators within the framework and how perhaps those could be exemplified. But of course, it's very much about your context and your setting and how it ties in with your improvement priorities and how those might shift over the next little while given the circumstances we're working within just now. But I hope it was helpful just to kind of have that idea and insight around a few of those areas. But as I said, I'm more than happy to talk about specific quality indicators and what that might mean for you in your setting over the coming months. But just to finish, what I wanted to do was give some ideas about how you could engage with this framework in your setting. And so, as I said earlier, underneath many of the quality indicators there are sets of challenge questions. And something that we've done in some of our schools, including some in Falkirk, is actually break those challenge questions out and look to engage our staff in thinking about what's already working well and what they might want to then take forward next when it comes to these particular areas. And I think it's such a rich way of finding out some of the things that are going on in individual stages or settings, something that could maybe be replicated in a different context. So, for example, an approach that's being used in numeracy might be equally valuable in STEM. So how can we understand what's working well and how we could build upon that? So within the file, I've included an example of a kind of template for that you could adapt to use with different challenge questions if that would be something that would be appropriate. Also really good to encourage and think about how we could engage in focus groups with young people, and that really does include that kind of idea about pupil leadership and pupil voice, but also even focus groups with our parents and other stakeholders, and thinking about how we could use this framework to engage them, bring in their views, bring in their expertise perhaps, think about the skills and talents they have and how we could capitalise on that within our setting. And also to think about a tool that we could use called Menti, which might be quite a nice way to just gauge opinion around a couple of key areas. So I'll just go through a couple of these in the next couple of slides. So if I was engaging with a school around the quality indicators, I'd probably have a slide like this up and use the kind of challenge question breakdown sheet that I was talking about a minute ago. And again, I'd just be focused on a couple of quality indicators, maybe 2 or 3 max. And what I'd be looking at is asking the staff in small groups to think about what they're already working on that's working well in relation to these questions, and then perhaps maybe where they would like to see things moving towards. And just often what I would do is get them to circulate around in small groups so they can start to see what other groups are saying too. So that might be something that's quite helpful before you then think about next steps. This little reflection tool, Menti or Mentimeter, is a free tool that you can use. But if you wanted to gauge opinion perhaps with the young people about certain aspects of STEM, perhaps around their aspirations, or indeed you wanted to ask them about skills and the skills that they think are important, perhaps something that you could do, as we did in a professional learning session, you can almost do a kind of pre and post evaluation. You can ask the young people or parents or teachers to rate, if you like, where they're at right now, and then when you reflect on it later, you can ask those same questions and then look at the difference to see how perhaps opinions or attitudes have changed in some way. So that's maybe something that's quite helpful. We've been talking about the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework, and as well as being a really useful route map or reflective tool that you can use within your setting, it can also help you actually apply to gain recognition through the STEM Nation Awards scheme, which is a scheme that's run through Education Scotland and the STEM team, so myself, but also Mary Thompson, who's the STEM Education Officer for Forth Valley and West Lothian, so she would be your local contact. And in the autumn term, we're hoping to relaunch the STEM Nation Award, and as you can see, it focuses on 5 key elements, and those relate to the quality indicators of the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you're thinking about going on a journey with STEM and you're going to be using the STEM self-evaluation and improvement framework, then it might be quite helpful to gather that evidence as you go and use it to apply for the STEM Nation Award further down the line. And again, there may be elements of this that you already think you're doing a great job in, and I'm sure you are. So maybe it's time to think about whether it would be right for you to apply for that award sooner rather than later. And Mary and I would be happy to help you with that, as would your RAISE officers. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you do have any questions, I'll be online on Friday morning at 10 o'clock with Laura and Barbara. But of course, if you have any other questions out with this time, please get in touch with them and they can pass on your questions or requests to me, and I'll happily get back in touch. Thank you very much.